We're recording. Sorry, guys.
Okay.
He's co-creator and co-producer with Robert William Stevens of Gatsby in Connecticut, a documentary that is a companion to his book, Boats Against the Current, The Honeymoon Summer of Scott and Zelda. And the New Yorker said about the documentary, in its hearty and individualistic vigor, Gatsby in Connecticut is a valuable work of literary criticism in cinematic form, which is high praise. And people that are our patrons, you can see the documentary on Canopy and also many other outlets. And if you need to know other outlets other than Canopy, you can go to GatsbyInCT.com. That's the website that tells you a lot more about what Mr. Webb is up to. And with that, thank you very much for being here, and we'll hand you over.
Thank you, Jocelyn, very much. And I just wanted to point out to the viewing audience that this has been the pandemic's been a tough time for librarians because they often put in a full day and then have to do a program at night. So I want to thank Jocelyn in particular and the Shelter Island Library for having me tonight. This is a story that's interesting, I think, on many levels. First of all, if you're interested in Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, and it's hard not to be, then you're in the right place. It's also a story of perseverance against the odds. And just to kind of set things off, when Scott and Zelda were in Westport, Connecticut, in the summer of 1920, they were facing identical challenges, literally exactly a century later that we do today. One was a worldwide pandemic. The only protection was masks, not to make light of COVID, but that killed 50 million people worldwide. And the worst race riots in American history since Reconstruction, a time when Black lives did not matter. And it was also the rise and the highest membership in the KKK in the country. In the 1920s, it spiked to its highest level ever. So white supremacy was on the rise. So if history doesn't repeat itself, as somebody said, it certainly rhymes. So I love just giving you the background about, what they were facing at the time. And what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to be showing you a series of images. I'm going to be interspersing that with 2 video clips from our documentary. I'll let you know when I'm going to make these transitions so you can, suffer along with me while I do that. And if you want to ask questions, you can put them in the chat function. I'll take them at the end. If you want to unmute yourself and, turn your video camera on, I'd be happy to take oral questions as well. So let me start the presentation. You're not going to see me to the end. I think that's a good thing for you, okay? You're not going to have a talking head. So let me, okay. Now, what you're going to see, of course, is a shameless plug for my book, but it also does serve a purpose. That is Scott and Zelda, by the way, in front of their honeymoon cottage in Westport, Connecticut. It still exists, and it's almost completely intact. As a matter of fact, it is completely intact. It's just had some additions. It's called Boats Against the Current. For you Gatsby buffs, you might remember that's in the last sentence of The Great Gatsby. But the reason I really picked it, besides that, obviously, was because it was emblematic of my journey to discover the origins of The Great Gatsby and come up with a new theory. It was not original. I built upon its work. You'll see about that later. Some of the original stuff that got me onto this quest some 45 years ago, I'm going to include. And when I first started this journey, a academic from the Fitzgerald Society, who's now become a good friend, said, Deej, which is my nickname, Deej, if you get Westport in the top 25 places that matter to the Fitzgeralds, it's a noble and it's a lost cause. So as I'm going to prove to you, it turned out to be #1, just by looking at the evidence, which people had really not bothered to do. the idea that Westport influenced The Great Gatsby went also against the theory of the leading Fitzgerald biographer of all time, Matthew Buckley. And he attempted to squash this theory. So we're going to talk about that as well. Here were all the works that featured Westport. Top center, The Beautiful and Damned, Scott's second novel, mostly written in Westport. And as Charles Scribner III said, this is a dry run for The Great Gatsby. So as Scott famously said, all my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he mined and plagiarized his own life and Zelda's relentlessly for material. Zelda Fitzgerald's only novel, Save Me the Waltz, to the left, features the same storyline as The Beautiful and Damned, and a young married couple is in Connecticut. Her only play, Scandalabra, took the premise of The Beautiful and Damned and reversed it. It was in 5 of Scott's short stories, and including a 6th kind of a novella called The Cruise of the Rolling Junk, and of course, The Great Gatsby. When they were in Westport, they had been in New York for 5 weeks. They get married in April in St. Patrick's Cathedral. Married for 5 weeks, they have the singular honor or notoriety of doing something that never happened before, during, or since, I believe. They get kicked out of the city of New York. That takes some work. Let me explain the final straw. They stayed at 2 of the finest hotels, the Biltmore and the Commodore. And in the last one, the last straw, I mean, Zelda in the interim was dancing nude in the fountains at Union Square. By the way, when they're in Westport as newlyweds, and this is where they have their honeymoon, she's 19. He's only 24. They're kids. They're kids. So what do? The final straw at one of those fine hotels? They abuse a brand new invention called the revolving door, in which they spun in the revolving door for 30 minutes and nobody could get in or out. So that was it. New York said, well, later, kids. And they buy a secondhand used Marmon and they travel to Westport, Connecticut, where he writes the majority of his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned. And we're going to start with this, and I'm going to move very quickly so we can get to Gatsby. But I think it's important to see the lead up to Gatsby and Westport's influence in it, because again, as Charles Scribner III said, now who's Charles Scribner? He's the grandson of Scribner and Sons that published Hemingway, Wolfe, and Fitzgerald. As he said, Deitch, this is the dry run for The Great Gatsby. I love what Scott said about the cover of this. He said, the artist got the girl pretty well. And he goes, but that's a rather debauched version of me. So just so you know, that is based upon what Scott looked like to the artist. Half of the book takes place in the fictional town of Marietta, which is Westport, and is straight out of their lives. It's as if Scott had written a diary and then took from the diary and wrote the novel. And I got interested in this at the age of 14 when I read it, and I was stunned to find the geography of Westport was all over it. And I mean yard by yard, mile by mile. As a child who rode his bike, I would ride around town. And the characters in The Beautiful and Damned traveled around town, literally taking lefts and rights and going to traffic circles where they exist. And I thought I had made a great discovery until I found out something called the internet. And this was a pretty well-known fact. Gatsby wasn't, and we'll get to that. As Walter Robichuk, the great Fitzgerald academic, said, no other novel, fictional novel in the 20th century reflects the geography in which it was written more than The Beautiful and Damned. Here's just a description. I'm going to talk while you read again. On May 14th, 1920, they get a realtor and they go to this pre-revolutionary house, which he beautifully describes here. And I got the town of Westport to declare May 14th Great Gatsby Day in honor of them signing the lease that day in 1920, a century and a year ago. And we celebrate it every year. COVID was a bit of a complication. But here he describes it was the Gray family, pre-revolutionary family. It was still owned by the Grays at the time that Scott and Zelda rented it. It was painted gray then, and it's always been painted gray. Again, the house is completely intact to this day. They added the porch to the right, and there's an addition on the back, but the entire thing, the core of it, is completely original. So now, don't be overwhelmed by this slide. Looks like a big giant broccoli salad. I will explain it in some detail. But what really got me hooked on The Beautiful and Damned was when I read a scene in which the character Gloria Patch, who is Zelda, runs out of the house during a raging thunderstorm, followed shortly thereafter by Anthony Patch, who is Scott, Gloria trying to run away from their home in Westport and make it to the train station to go to New York and escape, with Scott right behind her. So just, I'll show you this very quickly. Bottom right with that yellow tack right there, is the Fitzgerald house. By the way, it's on the corner of a 175-acre estate of a mystery millionaire. Ooh, we'll get to that later. What happened was during this party, one of Scott's sort of oafish Princeton friends began to hit on Zelda, and she ran out of the house in fear. When Scott discovers this a short time later, he follows her. And what we're going to do is I'm going to quickly just show you the outstanding one-to-one ratio between the geography and the novel. Zelda / Gloria ran up the road a bit to the center, then took a left here, took a right technically, and ran all the way to the train station where she jumped on a train. So let me take you through this scene. Literally, runs out of the house, starts the front path towards the road. Scott writes this straight from life. There's literally no deviation. And like he's going to do with Gatsby, or parts of it. Literally a half mile down the road, there's a single deserted barn. It's still there. It's now a private home and been built up. But at the time, that was the only house between where they lived and downtown Westport. Okay. I mean, we're talking an agrarian community that was fairly sparsely populated at the time. So again, straight out of life. Turns the fork, goes down the road, straight from life. There was a storm going on, but then it breaks and the moon comes out. Now, I'll give you a second to read this because this is important to our story. Okay, I love Scott's description of those towers. They still exist today. And how it's a giant spider. Gotta love Fitzgerald. But look what he is test driving for the first time. The green light. There it is, 5 years before Gatsby. Remember what Scott said. All my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald. That's the single most important color in 20th century American fiction, if not all of American fiction, symbolizing, of course, Gatsby's dream, and in a larger sense, of course, the American dream. But here Scott's playing with it and debuts it for the first time. So again, that's why I'm showing you The Beautiful and Damned, the lead up, the dry run to The Great Gatsby. The railroad bridge is obviously still there today. What's interesting is that Anthony Patch describes the plank, the pedestrian plank to the left, as being a yard wide. And indeed, it is exactly 3 feet wide to this day. And yes, I measured it. When you get halfway down the bridge and look to your right, there's the town of Westport in the distance. Now, 95 wasn't there. And the town was largely deforested, since it was still largely, but changing, an agrarian town. So you would have seen downtown clearly, straight from life. She runs to the train station, escapes on a train, Scott on another one quickly thereafter. And what they used to do is the train station house is also intact. And what they often used to do is climb on the roof of the station, straddle it, and wait for, after pulling all-nighters, wait for the 5:33 to New York City, and which was the first train. By the way, it took 70 minutes to get to New York from Westport in 1920. If you're lucky, it takes that long because it's quite a bit longer these days. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition to another series of images. So just hang with me for a second. I'll be right with you. Okay, oops, we don't want that. Promise. We are there. Let's go. Okay. And now let's get to what I'm sure many of you are really interested in, and who can blame you? The Great Gatsby and the influence of Westport. Again, a shameless plug for the book, but there it is. It really, truly is a beautiful book. It's as much a coffee table book with rare and in some cases never seen before photographs. There's only 2,500 that will ever be published, ever. So it's truly a limited edition. Once those 2,500 are sold, there will never be any more printed. And that was an arrangement I made with the Fitzgerald estate. It was protective, understandably, of their intellectual property and allowed me to use images never seen before. And they allowed me to do it at a very reasonable price. And it's not a cheap thing, I can tell you that. Okay. Again, just showing them on their wedding day. They were so young. Again, 24 and 19. And as Dorothy Parker wrote about them, they looked like they had just stepped out of the sun. They were such a good-looking couple. Okay, so I had also thought about Westport's influence on Gatsby, because I read it 2 years after I read The Beautiful and Damned. I read it, Gatsby, at 16, and I thought I recognized something about Westport. But it wasn't until I read this article by Barbara Probst Solomon, 1996, called Westport Wildlife. Barbara grew up in Westport and outstandingly pointed out all the tremendous evidence that Westport influenced the Great Gatsby. Now remember, when my book came out, it was said that by the leading Fitzgerald academic, that this was the most significant finding in Fitzgerald studies in the last half century. So again, if you're Fitzgerald buffs, I know you'll like it. But she wrote about that. Problem was, it went against the #1 Fitzgerald biographer, Matthew Broccoli, who believed it was only Great Neck. And, you know, that was it. And what he did was he pressured the New Yorker not to pursue publishing the article any further. So interesting lesson here. When even the great expert goes against the theory, they can be wrong as well. And I'm still here. I apologize. I have a dog named Daisy, and I've got another one named Zelda, and they needed a bit of attention. So you can still read this article. It's online. I believe it's September 1996, and it's called Westport Wildlife. So what I did was, after reading this, I put together a PowerPoint presentation, and I went and lectured about the role of Westport on The Beautiful and Damned and The Great Gatsby to schools, universities, and libraries. And this eventually turned into a book and a film, both of which you can look at. And I'll be showing you a couple of clips in a bit. Here's a photo I want to spend a little time on because I'm going to show you a series of succeeding images from this photo. This is the estate of a mystery millionaire. This is taken in the summer of 1920 when Scott and Zelda were there. They lived on the corner of it. Now, keep in mind that's in the book and that's in all the movies, but keep in mind in Great Neck, which everybody thinks Gatsby's about, when we visited Great Neck, it was a good couple of miles into the interior of Great Neck, and 2.5 miles from the coast. So it didn't fit. Now, by the way, it is very much about Great Neck as well. Okay, so one point I really need to make is that it's what I call a beachy blend between Great Neck and Westport. So let me show you, and I'll get to the Mystery Millionaire in just a second, but let me show you this estate. Bottom center right, there is the estate. It's still there today. It's also intact, although things have been grafted on too. Bottom right, you see this pathway? This pathway leading to sculpted gardens, leading to this reflecting pool, and leading to this band shell. This was the path that Scott and Zelda would cut down to go to the pool, to go to the band shell, and to go to a beach, one of the 3 private beaches that Lewis had. Here's his house. Okay, we'll be talking about that, obviously. And top left, you're going to notice this tower and this complex. This tower and this complex, also going to be part of our story. So the reflecting pool, the band shell, the house, the beach, the tower, and this structure are all going to be about as I roll forward. Here he is, the Mystery Millionaire. When I first started to look for him, there was only a single reference on the internet to him, and it was one sentence. Now, of course, that's a whole lot different. But this is F.E. Lewis on the left. He's on the back porch of Longshore, which it is still known as today, that 175-acre estate. It's still that large. It's now a public golf course, pool, restaurant, and hotel. There he is in the middle at the height of his powers. And there he is at the helm on the right of one of his 14 boats he kept at Longshore with a cowboy hat. Now, you know, you would expect him to have a captain's seafaring hat, but that cowboy hat's important to our story and why he's wearing it. So that's going to be really fun. Now, before we go any further, I want you to know that Frederick E. Lewis out Gatsby's Gatsby. Okay. Now, Gatsby was wealthy. He has a lot. We know that. Lewis had more. He had much more. So it's almost as if Scott felt he had to do a toned down version of Gatsby so he could make him believable, as unbelievable as Gatsby was. This guy's actually even more unbelievable. There's his house. Again, it still exists today with additions on it. It's a mansion by 1920 standards. It still is by today's standards, but you'll notice that this doesn't might fit to the model of Gatsby's house that you see in the films. But it does if you actually read Gatsby carefully. At one point at the beginning of the novel, it's kind of described as sort of a French chateau, turreted Norman castle sort of structure. But at the end, significantly, the very end of the book, Nick says, I went to that glorious ramshackle of a house. And as my friend Charles Scribner said, he goes, Deej, that's the description of Longshore. Here it is. Here's an aerial photo. A golf course was put in 5 years after Lewis sold the place. Here is the house. The core of the house is intact. You just saw a picture of it. This front part is the inn that was added, and there's a restaurant complex in the back. But what I want to do is show you at the very top center of this photograph, where you see these masts, this sea of masts. Now, this is now the Saugatuck Yacht Club, but at the time the Fitzgeralds and Lewis was there, it was the private estate known as Great Marsh. And this now full marina was the private marina of Great Marsh, which extended to the right as I go. All of these houses at that time were one estate called Great Marsh. And this is where Barbara Probst Solomon grew up. It had the longest dock in the vicinity. It had a green light at the end of the dock. They even had a lighthouse on the property, but watch this. Here, top center, was a beach. It's been built up since then, so it's not a beach anymore, but it was at the time of Lewis and Scott and Zelda being there. And they swam here, and they were very naughty about it, but that's for later. They swam here, and they would look straight across at Barbara Probst Solomon's estate. And so Barbara, at the end of the dock, looked over here and said, God, they must have been looking at this, and he's starting to think about the green light, which he'd already come up with in Westport. Now I'm going to stop the share for a second. I'm going to share with you a video clip, one of two that I'll be sharing with you from our documentary. Give me a second. I've got to do a little finagling, as you often have to do with Zoom. Let me, okay. No. Cancel. Give me a second here, folks. I am attempting to show you the video clip. Zoom's being a little slow, but just give me a second. Okay, it is not behaving. So what I have to do is make sure that you can actually hear the this video clip. And right now, we are having some problems. Well, let me try to do this another way, so just hang with me. Just hang with me. Again, this is the joy of Zoom. Sometimes it doesn't behave the way you want it to, but we will get it right up for you. So let's try a couple more things. And perfect, it is going to work. So, all right. So let me show you a clip. It's about 3 minutes. Let me introduce to you some of the people you'll see talking. One will be Scott and Zelda's granddaughter. Scott and Zelda only had one child. Scotty, and this is going to be Bobby Lanahan's, Scotty's daughter, talking about them. You're going to see Charles Scribner III of the Scribner House. You're going to see Sam Waterston, as you probably remember him from the 74 version of Gatsby. And let's just take a look at this clip. Who is Gatsby?
Who was Jay Gatsby modeled on?
I find it interesting that so many people are digging into who were the sources for Gatsby. There have been some specific names proposed, and then there have been other theories, so we may never know.
I heard he was in oil from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Texas.
I knew somebody who grew up with him in St. Paul.
Well, you look at him sometimes when he doesn't know anyone's looking at him. You can see it in his eyes. I bet he did kill a man.
Which one is he?
Yes, there is something ultimately about Gatsby that we never quite know.
You're not supposed to be able to grasp it.
Right,
Yeah.
his essence.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any one person who served as a model for Gatsby.
He took his experience, of course, as you're saying, it all comes from your own experience, but he blends different times of his life, different people he knew, with himself, and creates composites. In fact, Hemingway wrote him a famous letter criticizing him for that. You should base one character on one person, like I do. Like
Really?
Hemingway does, yeah.
You could have the ambition and the pretense that you would be able to see so thoroughly into another person's character that no part of you would show up in the description.
And
I'm not sure I believe
No,
that.
I don't either. And I think Fitzgerald wrote him back and rejected.
It all converges on Gatsby, and Gatsby is inexhaustible.
All those people who claim to have a piece of Scott's original raw material in their community, they might have a partial truth.
Everyone's colored by their own prejudice and where they grew up. So when we interview people from Long Island, they're all convinced Gatsby's from Long Island.
The danger of writing a book about Gatsby is that you then hear from all these people all over the world who've got the key.
We're not supposed to read Gatsby and think Westport. That wasn't Fitzgerald's intention. He wanted us to read Gatsby and think Long Island. But since he didn't have those experiences on Long Island, since they came out of his magic year of 1920 on Westport, where he had a beach, he had a cottage next to a mysterious recluse, that's what he's using as his model.
I think the interesting thing about all of these speculations and surmises and everything is that it's great if it enlivens the book. It's awful if it weighs it down.
My father was on the scene when we started to lose our way during Gatsby's time, and he recorded it all. The generosity, the greed, the innocence and the cynicism, the magnificence and the waste that was America between the two world wars. People read him now for clues and guidelines, as if by understanding him and his beautiful and damned period, they could see more clearly what's wrong.
The thing that jumps out for me is she also puts in and his beautiful and damn period, which is...
I can see that puts it right in your movie.
Yeah.
Okay, the wonderful and gracious Bobby Lanahan. And I'm going to just transition back here. And I'm about to go back to a series of images showing their spectacular stay in Westport on the corner of a 175-acre estate of a mystery millionaire. Sound familiar? It should. So let me share again. Again, there is Longshore today. By the way, it was named Longshore because it has got a mile of waterfront, a long shore. Okay, makes sense, right? In 1917, at the entrance of his 175-acre estate, Frederick E. Lewis, by the way, where did his money come from? He inherited, in today's dollars, $250 million at the age of 21. His great, 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 etc. ancestor was a major New York City banker, investor, and real estate owner, Moses Taylor. He is the 21st richest American in American history, according to celebrityworth.com. And why I'm showing you this image is that Fitzgerald puts it straight into Gatsby. So these are big posts. They are known as posterns. And Scott, or Nick, of course, that's Scott, writes or says at one point in Gatsby, instead of taking the shortcut by the Sound, and that's usually what they did to access the estate, they took a shortcut. Nick says, instead of taking a shortcut by the Sound, we went down the road a bit and we entered by the great big posterns. Well, there they are. He takes what was really a daily walk of theirs and he puts it straight into Gatsby. Okay, until you plagiarize it, it's not your own. Now, here is a Gatsby-esque scene, if there ever was one. This is a party in the summer of 1920. There's the reflecting pool and the band shell, as I pointed out earlier. Men in their white ducks, summer pants, and partygoers and dancers and drinkers. In the center left, and Fitzgerald uses, party scenes like this and puts them straight into Gatsby. In the center left, you see a jazz band right in front of the band shell. And he puts this straight into the book too, as he famously writes, Gatsby's band is no small, meaning average affair, but a full-blown jazz band with all the instruments. And there you see a full-blown jazz band with all the instruments, and the conductor dressed all in his summer whites. He had bridle trails all over the property. And as we're going to see, he was a champion horse breeder. Even Gatsby wasn't, but we're going to get to that. Okay, there he is on his right, on the right. And there he is with a cowboy hat, and he's in California. And to the left, you see that advertisement for a sale of livestock. He also owned, in what was known as Spadra, California, he owned an 8,000-acre ranch. Even Gatsby did not own something like this. 8,000 acres. He branded his livestock with a brand that was a diamond over a bar, and hence he called it, unsurprisingly, the Diamond Bar Ranch. And 8,000 acres, he had to build a halfway house, 4,000 acres in, so people could stop, spend the night, or rest before going to see the rest of it. It is now the entire city of Diamond Bar, California. Famous alumni include Alexis Morgan, the great soccer player, and Snoop Dogg, the great rapper. So I love that, the modern ones. And we also want to point out that on the right, oh, by the way, he had champion Duroc hogs, the best in the country. Top left, you see his livestock complex. He created a feeding system that is still in use today. So he was a champion rancher, champion hog breeder, champion livestock breeder. And more importantly, on the right, he is on Musan, his great Arabian stud. The Arabian was brought into the United States by Lewis and one other man. It was not a very popular breed at the time, but it became very popular. And indeed, this champion horse became Buffalo Bill Cody's favorite horse in his great Wild West shows. So, and the plot thickens. Here is the tower at Longshore. And I'm going to talk about that. I'll talk about the structure to the right in just a second. Fitzgerald, this was one of the three beaches at the base of it. Fitzgerald and Zelda swam here, and he puts it straight into the Gatsby when he talks about the guests swimming from the tower. There's the tower. And to the right was a big, giant complex. And this is a boathouse complex. What you're going to see here are the two spars coming up in front of the hydraulic door that could open and close. And this is where Lewis wintered any number of his 14 ships that he owned that were moored there, including this one. Look at that kahuna. That's the Kima. 55 sailors burned 4 tons of coal a day at sea and cost $1.5 million just to keep at the dock. What you'll notice is that these are US Navy sailors. Now, why? Lewis had this boat custom built in Stamford, Connecticut. He only owned it for a few more months, and then he donated it to the US Navy to patrol off of Battery Park during World War I against U-boats. And when the war was over, he said to the government, he's a patriotic guy, he said, keep it. And they did. Now, there he is, and now you understand why he's got a cowboy hat behind one of the boats at Longshore, and those are any number of his craft. By the way, I also believe that Lewis is the origin for Dan Cody. Dan Cody, for those of you that remember the novel, was where Jay Gatz, the young Jay Gatz, first sees his harbinger of wealth as he cruised on a big giant yacht. And again, this is Fitzgerald's first time on the East Coast as an adult. And I like to think he incorporated the yacht straight into that. So he's a champion horse breeder, hog breeder, okay? He's a champion yachtsman. We're not done, okay? What I didn't picture here were 2 of the fastest boats in the country called hydroplanes that he owned, triple Liberty 500 horsepower engines, aircraft engines, faster than most boats in the US Navy. Now, why am I mentioning a hydroplane? It's in Gatsby. When Gatsby famously says to Nick, hey, old sport, why don't we take a spin in my hydroplane along the Sound? But I want you to keep that term hydroplane in the back of your mind because it's got an additional meaning. We'll get to that in just a second. Here is his Stranger. This is a later yacht of his. It's more than a yacht, as you can see. He owned 7 of these over the course of his life in succeeding. He didn't own all 7 at once. They're all named the Stranger again. And this is in 1938 off of the West Coast, where again, he had that great big ranch. And he's about to go on a deep sea voyage to Southeast Asia. It was a marine biology expedition for the most part, but it also doubled as a spying mission. He was spying for the US government on Japanese naval and air installations. And indeed, in 3 years, the Japanese would attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. Now, here is another hydroplane. Yes, it's got a double meaning. This is a hydro sea plane, a hydroplane. These were exceedingly rare. Keep in mind that these were the planes of brand new invention, by and large, and a seaplane was even rarer. They're so dangerous that they're still not insured by insurance companies to this day. And nobody privately owned these. This is off of his estate. And again, when Fitzgerald, keep in mind that The Great Gatsby is under 50,000 words. Almost every sentence has meaning. And so when he says, Gatsby says to Nick, hey, old sport, do you want to jump in my hydroplane? It had a double meaning. It was supposed to convey that the guy had an awesome, fastest boat you could own, but he also had a plane. This was incredibly rare to own at that time period. Here he is with his lawyer. His lawyer. Oh, he needed one. I'll tell you about that in a second. This is his chauffeur, and it's his first wife, the first Mrs. Lewis. He had 4 wives, including the last wife that he had. The 4th was the 18-year-old daughter of his former college roommate. Interesting situation. When I really began to dig into Lewis, I found out that he was also a champion race car driver. Motoring magazines from 1907 to 1915 list him in races. Now, I'd like to say he came in first place. He never did, but he came in like third, fourth, and fifth place. What I love is in 1907, he lost to a car that was going at a top speed of 40 miles an hour. You just gotta love it, right? At one point, he has a custom Cadillac built. His goal is to drive from Connecticut, Westport, to go out to California. Very, very difficult thing to do at that time period. It broke down due to the horrendous condition of the roads. Because the motel hadn't been invented quite yet. He brought a bedroll and he was going to sleep on the side of the road as he went along. Broke down. What does he do? He gets a couple of private rail cars. He puts the car on one, himself in the other, and he just takes a train out to California. But what he also owned at Longshore was the 3 most expensive cars that you could own by and large in the country at that time. 2 of them worth $175,000 in today's money, and the big kahuna worth $260,000 in today's money. So, rancher, hog breeder, horse breeder, owner of a massive ranch, yachtsman, and car enthusiast. Out Gatsby's Gatsby. And again, my theory is Fitzgerald wouldn't believe somebody was this wealthy, so he kind of had to tone down Gatsby. Okay, take a second, and I'll give you a second to read these headlines and some of the bold print. This is the biggest party ever thrown in Connecticut history by Lewis in 1917. I'll give you a second to read that, and then we'll go through it. Okay. Now, this was an all-day party. It was a World War I fundraiser. And just to give you an idea of the wealth of the attendees, 800 cars were parked at this. Now, in 1917, I don't know how many cars were in the state of Connecticut, but that was probably most of them. When I went through the list of the industrialists and the bankers and the financial types that were at this party, in today's dollars, they were collectively worth in the tens of billions of dollars. He had the top entertainment America had at that time. He had Houdini come and do his famous escape trip. To take a look at the left-hand article, he had planes take people for rides. Now, keep in mind, this is 1917. Let's pretend your family, like everybody else who claims it, came over on the Mayflower. And that's 300 years before this event. Nobody, so you got to keep this in mind, nobody in the 300-year history of your family would ever have flown until you. Now, that is something you wouldn't forget at a party. Now, just give me a second, and if you can take a second to read it, I have to let my dog Daisy, named after Daisy Buchanan, out of the room, and I'll be back in 15 seconds. And by the way, we are now also joined by Zelda, my schnoodle. Come on, there you go, have a seat. Okay, it was a 3-ring circus, this party. There was always something going on all over the place at this party simultaneously. Just to let you know, it was literally a 3-ring circus. He brought out an entire animal circus from New York City. Half of it was shipped by barge and landed as if it were the Normandy invasion on the beaches of Longshore. The other half came by train and were detrained and then marched through Westport to the event. You can imagine what party goers, for some kids and adults, that was the first circus they ever saw. Ian Clare acted in a production there. That is Fitzgerald's favorite actress of all time. He wanted her to play Nicole in the 1934 film version of Tender is the Night. And she was highlighted by a stage production by David Belasco. David Belasco, who created the template for lighting and stage design that is still used today in musicals and in plays. By the way, his ghost is still said to haunt the Belasco Theater in New York. Annette Kellerman, who created the sport of synchronized swimming, did swimming lessons, and she also invented the most radical redesign of swimwear ever to that point. It was the one-piece swimsuit, it was form-hugging, and it was Zelda's favorite swimsuit. And by the way, she would pick a color that was a tannish brown beige, which made her look from afar as if she was naked, and she did that intentionally. Marceline the Clown was there, the most famous clown in American history. At a time today when Celine Dion or Britney Spears does a 1-year residency in Vegas, he did a 10-year at the Hippodrome, the largest venue in New York. And Charlie Chaplin, the single most important figure in cinema history, when he was asked what his influence was, he unabashedly said, "It is Marceline," basically saying he copied Marceline. Had his own comic strip named after him called, not surprisingly, Marceline the Clown. The pièce de résistance, and by the way, I'm giving you a short version of what was going on at this party, so I don't bore you to tears, but the pièce de résistance was at about midday. Partygoers heard the stampede of distant hooves coming closer and closer, and all of a sudden over the crest of a hill came a bouncing stagecoach pulled by Arabians, of course, being followed by whooping Indians who were being followed by cowboys, of course, with Lewis as the lead cowboy wearing a big white 10-gallon hat. The kicker to this story was that was a real Wells Fargo stagecoach from the mid-19th century, brought out by train by Lewis. Those were real cowboys from his California ranch, and more spectacularly, those were real Native Americans fresh off the frontier. So another thing people had never seen on the East Coast, real live Indians. So again, out Gatsby's Gatsby. I'll give you a second to read the bold print on these, and then I'll be describing two of them in some detail. This is from Westport during the time period that they were here, from the local paper. Okay, what Scott and Zelda also stumbled into was a town that voted 3-2 to ignore prohibition. It was one of the 2 states that didn't ratify prohibition, along with Rhode Island. There were 4 cops in the town at the time. 2 of them were Italian, and the Italians were known for not being fans of prohibition because of their tradition of growing their own grapes and making their own wine. And I can say this as part Irish. The other 2 cops were Irish, and they had no interest in upholding prohibition. So none of the busts in town were made by the local police, okay? They were all done by the federal government, either the state police, of Connecticut, or the Treasury Department of the federal government. But let me point out a couple of these headlines. Top center, truck carrying $17,000 worth of booze held up. By the way, that's $250,000 in today's money. And my favorite story, bottom left, about the taxi that overturned in town and began to spout alcohol. Alcohol that was in the dummy headlights, in the fenders, in the wheel wells, in the side quarter panels. The trunk and half the gas tank had been soldered to carry booze. So they are in the wild west of partying. And keep in mind, with the parties they're actually attending and the larger than life mystery millionaire they're right next to, it goes straight into Gatsby. On the right was the most popular speakeasy between New York and Boston. It was a mile away from the Fitzgerald house. George Raft, Jimmy Cagney, Humphrey Bogart were frequent visitors. And to the left, I'm going to give you a second to read that article. Okay, there's Scott and Zelda driving from their home to the less than a mile away speakeasy. They were probably already partying before they got into the car. And he gets in an accident. And he puts this straight into Gatsby, because you'll notice what is the accident feature? The same thing that's featured in Gatsby when one of the guests wrecks a car leaving Gatsby's party. What happens? He loses a wheel. So Fitzgerald takes his own experience. Remember what he said again, all my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he puts it straight into Gatsby. On the left, the other notorious speakeasy, the Campo Inn, with its steep driveway that Zelda, we have eyewitness accounts of her coming down that driveway, straddling the hood of a taxi, hanging onto the front ornament for dear life, and naked. So, party on. But more notably on the right is Bald Jack Rose, the rum runner, the gambling house operator from New York City. Bald Jack because he had alopecia, so he had no hair. But Bald Jack provided the booze that the town drank and that Scott and Zelda drank. And Fitzgerald puts him straight into the Great Gatsby in the character of Meyer Wolfsheim. And the reason you can see that is that Meyer Wolfsheim famously talks about the murder of Rosie Rosenthal at the Metropole. And Bald Jack Rose was a witness to that murder and turned state's evidence against the corrupt cop that ordered the hit. So Bald Jack Rose was actually involved in that very, very, very famous case that Meyer Wolfsheim refers to in the novel. All right, give you a second to read. Again, the Wild West nature of the town. Scott and Zelda on Lewis's private beach were engaged in what Edmund Wilson, the great literary critic and former friend of Scott's, or no, current friend of Scott's from Princeton, said famously that Scott and Zelda were engaged in the nude orgies of Westport. Quote unquote, very Gatsby. Here is the sale of what was Longshore Farms in Country Life, the upscale magazine in 1925, again featuring many of the highlights of the place that I pointed out to you earlier. Here is our award-winning documentary, Gatsby in Connecticut. The New Yorker published its list of what it saw as the top 36 films of 2020, and we're happy to come in at number 30. And by the way, this is on all streaming platforms. And we've won multiple awards, we're proud to say. One more time, the cover of my book, it truly is a beautiful book. And now I'm gonna end the presentation with a short film clip of Sam Waterston reading the immortal last line, last page of The Great Gatsby. So give me a second to transition to that. It's coming right up. And to see Sam Waterston again read this out was one of the most emotional moments of my life, to see this play out in front of me. So without further ado, the ending of our documentary.
Then I wandered down to the beach and sprawled out on the sand. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. A fresh, green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face, for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
Well, there you go. And again, just a tremendously emotional moment for myself to see Sam Waterston do the last line of The Great Gatsby. By the way, over my shoulder, you're going to see Zelda and Daisy, my schnoodle and Havanese, and yes, I'm that crazy. I see that we don't have any questions via the chat function. And what I'd like to do is, thank again the Shelter Island Library, Jocelyn in particular, because I know she's put in a lot of long hours, like many of the librarians that I've worked with. So Daisy is crawling behind me, and she's being very, very, very not naughty, which is kind of a rare state of affairs. So we'd like to thank Daisy Webb also for behaving in the background. So Jocelyn, thanks a gazillion. I really appreciate it. You're muted.
Yeah, we so appreciate, and that was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
To see, this imagery that I had known from high school, and to see the images as they actually were was just incredible.
Oh, thanks. No, yeah. And what's interesting is, writing is hard. So what Fitzgerald did, again, was he took so much. All my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald, one more time. And he also plagiarized himself. So, for example, he took elements of Gatsby from a couple of other short stories. Again, he took it from The Beautiful and Damned. He used in The Beautiful and Damned, and he used in Gatsby, and to an extent, Tender is the Night, the basic themes of wealth and corruption and what it does to people. So he, you know, he had a focus, but what I love is that he plagiarized his own life and himself, which I think is important. I think everybody's got a book in them. I think that write what you know, and I think everybody should try. Write about yourself. You guarantee you're more interesting than you probably give yourself credit for. Everybody, you know, everybody. So if Scott Fitzgerald did that, we can do it. Okay, so there's no shame. And there's a great line I used to tell my students, Jocelyn. I used to say, until you plagiarize it, it's not your own. And what I mean by that comment is that when I taught the American Revolution, I wasn't at that big event. So what did I do? I took a lot of sources that I read and I plagiarized it. I made it my own, and I taught my students with it. So it's I always told them, like, well, you know, make sure you give credit, but it's totally okay to plagiarize all the time. And I recommend everybody plagiarize. And I love saying that to a librarian.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating, and it makes me want to go back and read Gatsby again, and then read the Fitzgerald novels that I haven't read yet. So thank you for inspiring us, and really appreciate it, Richard.
Yeah, listen, it's my signal honor. And Jocelyn, it's as beautiful a day I can see behind you as it is out here. Yeah. And there's a strawberry moon tonight. And so what I'm going to do pretty shortly is I'm going to take a walk with my lovely bride and Daisy and Zelda. And we're going to go to Campo Beach, where Scott and Zelda used to swim.
That's perfect.
Yep, and we're going to take a look at the strawberry moon. So bless you, stay safe, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.